The doctor said my 8-year-old daughter Tessa had one narrow window left for a stem cell transplant, and every close biological relative needed to be tested immediately. My parents came to the hospital dressed for my sister Sloane's graduation. When I told them the donor center was waiting downstairs, Mom looked at the clock. "We are not missing her ceremony for one hospital test," she said. "Tessa has doctors. Sloane only graduates once." Through the glass doors, my daughter watched them step into the elevator in their formal clothes. Her small hand tightened around mine. "Aren't Grandma and Grandpa coming to save me?" she whispered. Later, Mom sent me a message she claimed came from Sloane. It said, "I'm not leaving my graduation for a child I gave away 8 years ago." Something about those words felt wrong. Sloane had never called Tessa a child I gave away. Not once. So, I stopped begging. I called Jonah Mercer, the family attorney who had handled Tessa's adoption. I asked him one question. What did Sloane actually sign 8 years ago? 47 minutes later, my mother called back screaming, "We'll take the test. We'll do anything. Just don't send Sloane that affidavit." Stay with me, because what that hidden affidavit revealed would destroy the story my parents had forced us to believe for 8 years. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened next. 3 weeks earlier, I had believed the worst part of Tessa's illness was behind us. She had finished another round of treatment, and the bruises on her arms were beginning to fade. She had even planned what she would wear when she returned to school. Then her latest tests came back. Dr. Elena Park asked me to sit before telling me the leukemia had returned. Chemotherapy alone was unlikely to be enough this time. Tessa's best remaining option was a hematopoietic stem cell transplant, and the team needed HLA samples from close biological relatives as quickly as possible. Dr. Park did not promise a miracle. A relative who shared enough markers would still need medical screening and further evaluation. Even a suitable donor could not guarantee a successful transplant. "What happens if we do not find someone soon?" I asked. "We may lose the opportunity to move her into the next preparation cycle," she said. "I do not want you to hear an exact countdown, but delay matters." That frightened me more than a dramatic deadline. We did not have 1 hour in which a single person could walk in and save Tessa. We had a shrinking set of choices, and every wasted day could remove one. My parents knew that. I had emailed them Dr. Park's explanation 2 days earlier. The transplant coordinator had also sent instructions for the first stage sample collection. No surgery, and no promise to donate. They only needed to sign the forms and provide blood and a cheek swab. Beverly and Raymond Keller arrived at the hospital shortly before noon, dressed for Sloane's graduation. My mother wore a pale blue suit with pearl buttons. My father wore the charcoal jacket he saved for formal photographs. For one hopeful second, I thought they had come to help. Mom checked the clock above the reception desk. "We only have 10 minutes. The graduation venue is across town." "The donor center is 2 floors down," I said. "They are waiting for you." Her expression tightened. "Adrian, do not start." That phrase had controlled me since childhood. It meant, do not disagree, do not embarrass her, and do not say the quiet part where other people could hear it. "I am not starting anything. Tessa needs you tested." Dad looked away. "Today is Sloane's day. Tessa's treatment cannot be arranged around a ceremony. A hospital test can be done tomorrow," Mom said. "Sloane only graduates once." Dr. Park said delay matters. "Tessa has doctors. Sloane has one family. And we are not letting you ruin this for her." They had not come to be tested. Mom had brought a gift bag with fuzzy socks, a puzzle book, and a card signed by both of them. It was the kind of visit that could be photographed and shown to friends. There was no appointment confirmation, and no promise to return. Tessa sat in a wheelchair near the glass doors when they turned toward the elevator. She had lost enough weight that the hospital blanket seemed to swallow her, but she still raised one hand. "Grandma?" Mom paused without turning fully. "We will call you later, sweetheart. Are you going to do the test?" The elevator opened. Dad pressed his lips together. Mom stepped inside first. Tessa watched the doors close, then looked up at me, her fingers wrapped around mine. Aren't Grandma and Grandpa coming to save me? I could not tell her they were coming back because I no longer believed it. I could not tell her the test would save her because the doctors had never promised that. I knelt beside her and said, I am going to keep finding people who will show up. She nodded as if she were comforting me, then asked whether the cheek swab tasted worse than hospital oatmeal. It has serious competition, I told her. That earned me half a smile. After the nurse took her back to her room, I called Mom again. By then she was at the graduation hall. I could hear applause and camera shutters behind her. I need Sloane's number, I said. You have it. The number I have goes straight to voicemail. She is preparing to walk across the stage. Leave her alone. She is Tessa's biological relative. The hospital needs to speak to her directly. Mom was silent for a moment. Sloane knows. She said no. My chest tightened. Sloane and I were not close, but I had never heard her speak cruelly about Tessa. She avoided the subject, which was not kindness, but it was not hatred either. Let me hear it from her. You do not get to drag her backward, because your life is difficult. My daughter may die, and my daughter is graduating today. The distinction was deliberate. Sloane was her daughter. Tessa was merely mine. A minute after she ended the call, a screenshot appeared on my phone. I'm not leaving my graduation for a child I gave away 8 years ago. Stop asking Mom to make me feel guilty. The words hurt so badly that I almost missed what was wrong with them. Sloane had never called Tessa a child I gave away. Even 8 years ago, she had called her the baby. On the rare occasions she asked anything later, she used Tessa's name. This sentence sounded formal and punishing. It sounded like Mom. The screenshot had also been cropped so tightly that I could not see the time, the contact name, or any earlier messages. I called the transplant coordinator and asked whether anyone had spoken directly to Sloane. No, she said. The number provided for her forwarded to voicemail. We left a message. Who provided the number? She checked the record. Beverly Keller. My mother had placed herself between the hospital and every biological relative on the list. For 8 years, I had accepted that Sloane wanted nothing to do with Tessa because my parents had repeated it until it felt like a fact. I had never seen Sloane's original statement. I had never heard her explain the adoption without Mom in the room. I found Jonah Mercer's number in an old folder. He had handled Tessa's adoption and the agreements surrounding it. When he answered, I asked, what did Sloane actually sign 8 years ago? The silence on his end frightened me. Why are you asking today? He said. I told him about Tessa, the donor testing, the graduation, and the screenshot. Forward it to me. I need to review the file. What file? There is an affidavit you were never shown. My hand went cold around the phone. What does it say? I will not summarize a legal statement from memory. Give me time to verify it, then I will contact the necessary people directly. Tessa does not have time for another family secret. I understand, he said. That is why Beverly will not control the next conversation. 47 minutes later, my phone rang. Mom's name flashed across the screen. The celebration noise was gone. We'll take the test, she screamed. We'll do anything. Just don't send Sloane that affidavit. In that instant, I knew my mother was more afraid of one old document than she was of losing her granddaughter, and I needed to know why. My mother was still breathing hard when I asked what affidavit she meant. For a moment, the only sound on the line was the muffled announcement of graduates' names somewhere behind her. You called Jonah to frighten us, she said. You have no idea what you are interfering with. I called him because my daughter needs biological relatives tested, and you sent me a message claiming Sloane refused. She did refuse. Then why are you terrified of her seeing something she signed herself? Mom lowered her voice. Because Sloane has worked too hard to build a stable life. That document was written by a frightened teenager. Dragging it out today would be cruel. Tessa is 8 years old, Mom. She is lying in a hospital while you protect a graduation photograph. We said we would take the test. Without conditions? She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. We will talk when we return, she said. Do not send anything to Sloan before then. The line went dead. I stared at the screenshot again. Once the first shock had passed, the construction of the lie became easier to see. There was no contact name at the top, no timestamp, and no earlier exchange. The message had been cropped so tightly that it could have come from anyone. More importantly, it did not sound like my sister. Sloan avoided emotional conversations. She answered questions with short, careful phrases and disappeared whenever the past came too close. She had never said she regretted Tessa, but she had also never offered to be part of her life. That distance had hurt me for years, yet the cruelty in the screenshot felt rehearsed. A child I gave away was the kind of phrase my mother used when she wanted to turn a human being into an old decision. Sloan had always called her the baby in those first months. Later, on the rare occasions she asked about her, she used Tessa's name. I enlarged the screenshot and noticed another detail. The punctuation was perfect. Sloan rarely used periods in text messages, and she always shortened because to BC when typing quickly. The message contained none of her habits. I forwarded the image to Jonah, then walked to the transplant coordinator's office while Tessa slept. The coordinator, Melissa, pulled up the family contact list on her computer. I need to know exactly who your office contacted, I said. Melissa turned the screen slightly away to protect the records. We called the numbers provided on the family history form. We reached your mother and father directly. And Sloan? The call went to voicemail. We left a message explaining that the hospital needed to discuss urgent family testing. Did anyone speak to her personally? No. Who gave you her number? Melissa checked the submission. Beverly Keller. I gave her the number I had saved for Sloan. It was different by 1 digit. Melissa tried it while I stood there. The call rang 6 times before going to voicemail, and Sloan's recorded voice confirmed it was hers. My mother had not made a mistake. She had provided the hospital with the wrong number. I asked Melissa to note the correction and send the urgent request again. She could not discuss Tessa's private medical details without verifying Sloan's identity, but she could ask her to contact the transplant team directly. As I left the office, my phone vibrated. Jonah had received the screenshot. The image is incomplete, he wrote. Do not rely on it as evidence of Sloan's refusal. I am reviewing the original file now. I returned to Tessa's room and found her awake, arranging colored pencils across the blanket by length. She looked at my face and immediately stopped. Did Grandma call? She did. Are they coming? They said they would take the test, but I need to make sure they mean it. Tessa selected a blue pencil and drew a shaky circle on the page. Maybe they are scared of needles. Maybe. I'm scared of needles, and I still come. There was no accusation in her voice, which made the sentence harder to hear. I sat beside her and helped turn the circle into a lopsided planet. She asked whether people on Mars had blood tests. I told her they probably used laser beams, which she said was unfair because hospitals on Earth should have invented that already. For 10 minutes, I let myself stay inside her drawing, instead of the truth waiting on my phone. Jonah called shortly afterward. I stepped into the hallway, but stayed close enough to see Tessa through the open door. I found the affidavit, he said. What does it say? It says the adoption was not presented to Sloan as a free choice. My hand tightened around the phone. Did she want to keep Tessa? The document is more complicated than that. She acknowledged she was not prepared to raise a child independently, and she named you as the person she trusted to provide care. But she also stated that she wanted continued information and eventual contact. I leaned against the wall. My parents told me she wanted a complete separation. That was not what she wrote. Why didn't you show me? Because Beverly insisted the statement was privileged communication connected to Sloan's legal interests. At the time, you had separate documents establishing your guardianship and later adoption. I advised the family that Sloan needed independent counsel. Beverly said another attorney had spoken to her privately. Did that happen? I have no record proving it did. Anger rose in me, followed immediately by shame. I wanted to blame Jonah, my parents, and every adult who had allowed a 16-year-old girl to sign away more than she understood. But I had been there too. I remembered Sloane, sitting at the dining room table 8 years earlier, wearing an oversized sweatshirt despite the heat. Her eyes had been swollen. Mom had kept one hand on her shoulder while explaining that the arrangement was best for everyone. I had been terrified they would change their minds and place the baby with strangers. I had focused on getting Tessa somewhere safe. When Sloane cried after signing, I told myself grief did not mean coercion. I accepted my parents' version because it gave me what I needed most, the right to take the baby home. I should have asked more questions, I said. You were also being controlled by the information Beverly gave you, Jonah replied. That does not mean I had no choices. He did not argue. I asked whether he had contacted Sloane. Not yet. I sent her a request to call me directly. Before I provide the affidavit, I need to verify her identity and explain what it contains. I have also notified Beverly and Raymond to preserve all communications concerning Tessa's adoption and the current donor request. That is why Mom called. Yes. She asked me not to contact Sloane until after the ceremony. What did you tell her? That a ceremony does not override a medical emergency or Sloane's right to receive information about her own signed statement. After the call, I searched my email for the messages I had sent my parents about donor testing. I found the hospital instructions, then noticed Beverly had forwarded one of them to Raymond the previous evening. Her message above it read, "We must keep Sloane focused tomorrow. Adrian is making the situation sound urgent again." Attached below was Dr. Park's letter. The first paragraph clearly stated that Tessa's condition required urgent family donor evaluation and that delays could reduce available treatment options. My parents had not misunderstood. They had read the warning and decided the danger was inconvenient. Dad called before I could confront them. "Your mother is upset," he said. "Tessa is sick. We know that, but you are escalating this into something destructive. Did you know Mom gave the hospital the wrong number for Sloane?" He paused. "It may have been an old number. It was changed by 1 digit. Adrian, this is not the moment to investigate everyone. This is exactly the moment. Did Sloane know the doctors needed her today?" "She knew there was testing." "That is not what I asked." He sighed as if I were an unreasonable child. "Your mother did not want her walking onto the stage thinking a little girl's life depended on her." "A little girl? You know what I mean." "Yes, I do." He tried to soften his voice. "Sloane has carried enough guilt. Let her have 1 day before you reopen everything." There it was. Sloane had not refused. My parents had decided she should not be given the chance to choose. I asked who had deleted the hospital's voicemail from the shared family phone account. Dad denied knowing what I meant, but his answer came too quickly. Before ending the call, he said, "Do not send that document to your sister. Once she reads it, none of us can put this family back together." I looked through the doorway at Tessa, who was coloring Mars blue because she said red was too obvious. My father was worried about putting the family back together. I was worried about keeping my daughter alive. Jonah called again 20 minutes later. "Sloane has not responded yet," he said. "But there is one sentence in her affidavit you need to hear before anything else happens." I braced myself. He read it slowly. "I do not want my sister to believe I abandoned my baby. For 8 years, I had believed Sloane wanted Tessa erased from her life. Now I knew someone had worked very hard to make sure I believed it." Jonah's words followed me back into Tessa's room. "I do not want my sister to believe I abandoned my baby. For 8 years, I had carried the opposite belief so completely that it had shaped every boundary around my daughter's life." Tessa was asleep, one hand resting near the blue planet she had drawn. I sat beside her and tried to remember the day Sloane told us she was pregnant without using my mother's version of it. Sloane had been 16. She came home from school on a rainy Thursday and locked herself in the bathroom for almost an hour. By dinner, Mom had taken her phone, canceled her weekend plans, and called the school to say she would be absent until further notice. No one asked Sloane what she wanted in front of me. Mom spoke for her from the beginning. "This is a family emergency," she had said. "We need adults making decisions, not a frightened child." At 32, I was the adult she chose to involve. I had wanted children for years, but a failed marriage and 2 unsuccessful fertility treatments had left me trying to accept that motherhood might not happen for me. Mom knew exactly where to press. "She cannot raise a baby," she told me. "You can. If we handle this privately, the child stays in the family, and Sloane still has a future." The arrangement sounded merciful when she described it. Sloane would finish school and attend college. The baby would grow up with someone who already loved her. Mom repeated that no one was being punished, and everyone was being protected. I wanted to believe her because the alternative frightened me. She said that if I refused, the baby might be placed with strangers. She warned that Sloane could change her mind and disappear with the child, or reject her completely after birth. I never saw evidence of those claims. I accepted them because I was terrified of losing a baby I had not yet been given. During the pregnancy, Mom controlled every conversation. She answered medical questions for Sloane, scheduled appointments, and decided who could visit. When I tried to speak with my sister alone, Mom said those discussions caused panic attacks and could endanger the pregnancy. Sloane became quieter each month. She stopped arguing in front of us, which I mistook for agreement. Looking back, silence had been the only response Mom could not use against her. Near the end of the pregnancy, Mom presented me with conditions. I was not to tell Tessa the identity of her biological mother until the family agreed. I was not to ask Sloane for money, childcare, or emotional involvement. I was not to bring the child to Sloane's school events or future workplace. Most of all, I was never to use the adoption to interfere with what Mom called Sloane's second chance. It was not the formal adoption decree. It was a private family document written to look official enough that I felt bound by it. Jonah warned that some language was inappropriate, but Mom treated every objection as a threat to place the baby elsewhere. I signed. At the time, I told myself the conditions did not matter because I would be the one raising the child. I believed love would make the secrecy harmless. I did not understand that the secrecy was meant to preserve Mom's authority over all of us. Jonah called while I was still beside the hospital bed. He had reviewed the remaining pages and agreed to explain what he could. "The affidavit was written before the final adoption," he said. "Sloane stated that she trusted you to care for the baby because she did not have the independence or resources to do so herself. That sounds voluntary." That part was. The conditions surrounding it were not. He explained that Sloane had written that Mom threatened to remove her from school, send her to live with distant relatives, and stop paying for any education if she refused the family plan. She was also told that if she made the process difficult, the baby would not go to me. The child would be placed with a family she would never know. I closed my eyes. That had been the same fear Mom used on me. "She controlled both sides," I said. "Yes." "What did Sloane ask for?" "Information, photographs, confirmation that the child was safe. She wanted the possibility of contact when she was older and capable of making decisions without relying on your parents." My throat tightened. Every birthday, I sent Mom pictures because she said she would decide whether Sloane was emotionally ready to see them. I had no way of knowing whether my sister received a single one. Why was none of that in the final arrangement? Beverly argued that continued contact would confuse the child and destabilize Sloane. She claimed Sloane had withdrawn the request after consulting another attorney. "Did you speak to that attorney?" "I was given a name, but I never received a letter of representation or written advice." I objected. "Your mother said the family would proceed elsewhere if I delayed the guardianship. Why didn't you stop it?" Jonah was quiet before answering. The immediate question was where the infant would be safest. "You had passed the required checks, had stable housing, and were prepared to care for her. Challenging the process might have delayed placement. I believed preserving Sloane's affidavit was the best protection I could provide then. It was not a satisfying answer. Jonah had documented a problem and still allowed a flawed arrangement to continue because Tessa needed a safe home. I understood the compromise because I had made my own. The worst memory returned while he spoke. On the morning Sloane signed the final papers, she sat at our parents' dining table in an oversized gray sweatshirt. It was July, but she kept pulling the sleeves over her hands. Her eyes were swollen, and she stared at the signature line until Mom placed a pen between her fingers. "You said this was what you wanted," Mom told her. Sloane looked at me. I had seen fear in her face, but I was holding newborn Tessa against my chest. Every instinct in me was focused on keeping that baby safe. I told myself Sloane was grieving, and that grief did not mean she wanted to reverse the plan. I feared that asking questions would cause my parents to take Tessa away from both of us. So I remained silent while she signed. Remembering it now, I could not claim I had seen nothing. I had seen enough to feel uneasy. I had chosen the explanation that allowed me to leave with Tessa. A nurse interrupted to say Dr. Park wanted to repeat one of Tessa's blood tests. Her temperature had risen slightly, and the team needed to rule out an infection before the next stage of treatment. It was not a crisis, but the nurse's careful tone reminded me how little room we had for delays. Tessa woke when they prepared the line. She watched the nurse arrange the tubes and sighed. "More vampire snacks? Apparently the vampires are very organized today," I said. She rolled her eyes but held out her arm. Afterward, she asked whether Grandma and Grandpa had changed their minds. "They said they would come back," I told her. "But I am not waiting for promises anymore." That was the first honest answer I had given either of us all day. When the nurse left, I checked my email. Jonah had sent a preservation notice to my parents, instructing them not to delete messages, call records, or documents related to the adoption and donor request. Beneath it was the urgent email he had sent to Sloane. The subject line read, "Urgent medical information concerning Tessa Keller." His message asked her to contact him directly and warned her not to rely on second-hand descriptions from any family member. He had not attached the affidavit. He wanted to verify her identity and explain the document first. I stared at her address, tempted to write to her myself. 8 years earlier, I had allowed Mom to stand between us because I was afraid of losing Tessa. Now that same silence could cost my daughter the chance to be tested by her closest biological relative. I began drafting a message, then stopped. If Sloane answered Jonah, she needed to hear the truth, without my fear shaping it, and without Mom translating it first. For the first time in 8 years, the truth was traveling toward my sister, through a path our mother did not control. My parents returned to the hospital less than an hour after Jonah sent the preservation notice. They were still dressed for the graduation ceremony. Mom's pale blue suit was perfectly pressed, and Dad still wore the silver tie Sloane had chosen for him. Neither of them looked like they had rushed across town because their granddaughter needed help. Mom entered Tessa's room carrying the same gift bag she had left beside the reception desk earlier. Her expression changed the moment she saw the nurse. She softened her voice, touched my shoulder, and asked how her precious girl was feeling. Tessa looked toward her hopefully. "Are you doing the test now?" she asked. Mom glanced at me before answering. "Your mother and I are discussing it." There was nothing to discuss. The donor center was open, the staff was waiting, and both of my parents had already been given the consent forms. I asked the nurse to stay with Tessa while we spoke outside. Mom led us toward an empty family consultation room as if she had arranged the meeting herself. Dad closed the door behind us. "We came back," Mom said. "That should prove we are willing to cooperate. Then go downstairs and provide the samples." She placed a leather folder on the table. "First, we need assurances." I did not touch it. "What kind of assurances?" "That private family matters remain private." She opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. The document had been prepared quickly, but the language was formal. It required me to promise that I would not send Sloan the affidavit, discuss the circumstances surrounding Tessa's adoption, or contact anyone associated with Mom's organization. I would also agree not to tell Tessa the identity of her biological mother without written consent from Beverly and Raymond. At the bottom was another clause stating that any public accusation of coercion, deception, or interference would cause my parents to withdraw from all voluntary medical participation. I read that section twice. You made your test conditional on my silence. Mom folded her hands. We are protecting everyone involved. You gave the hospital the wrong number for Sloan. That was an administrative mistake. You sent me a message she did not write. You have no proof of that. You are asking me to sign this before you give a cheek swab. Dad moved closer to the table. Adrian, no one is asking you to surrender anything important. Sign it, let us do the test, and then we can all focus on Tessa. The simplicity of his request almost broke me. Tessa was only a few yards away. If there was even a small chance one of them could help, signing a few pages felt easier than risking another delay. I picked up the pen. Mom watched my hand, not my face. That was when I understood she was not asking for privacy. She was buying obedience. If I signed, the same people who had controlled the truth for 8 years would decide what Tessa was allowed to know, what Sloan was allowed to remember, and what I was allowed to say. I put the pen down. Mom's expression hardened. Do not make this about your pride. This is not pride. You are using Tessa's treatment to protect yourself. We are offering our blood. You are offering a sample, and you need it. Her voice was quiet now, which was always when she was most dangerous. You want our blood, she said. We want your silence. Dad looked uncomfortable, but did not object. I called Jonah and put him on speaker. He confirmed that I should not sign any agreement under pressure, especially one tying medical cooperation to silence about possible misconduct. Mom leaned toward the phone. You are advising her to reject 2 potential donors. I am advising her not to sign a coercive document, Jonah replied. Your choice to be tested remains voluntary and separate. You have no right to interfere in this family. You asked me to handle this family's legal documents 8 years ago. You do not get to invoke that relationship only when it protects you. Mom ended the call by pressing the screen with one sharp finger. Dad lowered his voice. Sign it just for today. We can argue about the wording later. I looked at him. Would you tell Tessa that her chance of finding a donor depended on whether I agreed to lie? Of course not. Then do not ask me to do it. For a few seconds, I thought he might finally take the consent forms and leave Mom sitting there. He stared at the folder, then at the door leading back toward Tessa's room. Instead, he said, your mother is trying to hold this family together. The same excuse again. Every time Mom hurt someone, Dad called the damage unity and the silence peace. Dr. Park entered after the nurse informed her there was a dispute. She did not sit down. I need to make the hospital's position clear, she said. No one is required to undergo donor testing. However, we will not participate in private agreements that connect medical cooperation to non-disclosure. Mom closed the folder. This has nothing to do with the hospital. It is occurring inside my patient's treatment area and concerns access to donor evaluation. That makes it relevant. We only want protection from false accusations. Then address those accusations through appropriate legal channels. Do not place the patient between them. Dr. Park explained again that testing did not guarantee either of my parents would be suitable donors. Their samples could help the team understand available options, but participation had to be voluntary and free of coercion on all sides. Mom smiled without warmth. Then we are choosing not to participate. She stood and pulled the temporary registration band from her wrist. Dad had received one at the donor desk when they returned. He looked at his own band but did not remove it immediately. Raymond, Mom said. He slowly tore it off and placed it beside hers. The small plastic strips landed on the table with less sound than they deserved. You came all the way back to make me choose between the truth and my daughter, I said. No, Mom replied. You are the one choosing. She picked up the folder and turned toward the door. I did not stop her. Every part of me wanted to. I wanted to grab the consent forms, follow them downstairs, and promise anything necessary. I could hear Tessa talking softly with the nurse outside, unaware that her grandparents had just withdrawn because I refused to protect their secret. Dr. Park remained beside me. We will continue searching, she said. Your parents are not the only possible path. Mom opened the consultation room door. When Adrian is ready to act like a mother instead of a prosecutor, she knows where to find us. The elevator at the end of the hallway chimed before I could answer. The doors opened and Sloane stepped out. She was still wearing the dark dress she had chosen for graduation, but the gown was gone. Her hair had fallen loose around her shoulders, and the gold tassel that should have been attached to her cap was wrapped tightly around one hand. In the other, she held a white envelope. Jonah's name was printed in the corner. Mom stopped walking. Sloane looked from the torn donor bands on the table to the folder under Mom's arm. Then she looked at me. What is happening? She asked. Mom moved toward her. You should not be here. Sloane stepped back. Jonah called me. He sent me a copy of the statement I signed when I was 16. Dad's face lost its color. Mom reached for the envelope. This is not the place to discuss that. Sloane pulled it against her chest. You told me Tessa was having routine tests. She has doctors handling her condition. You told Adrian I refused to come. Mom glanced toward me. She misunderstood. Sloane took out her phone and held up the screenshot Mom had sent me. I did not write this. No one spoke. The hallway seemed to narrow around us. Nurses continued moving past the far end, and a cart rolled across the polished floor. But inside that small space, every lie my parents had maintained for 8 years was finally standing beside the people it had separated. Sloane looked at our mother, then at me. Her voice shook, but she did not look away. What did you tell Adrian I wanted? Sloane's question hung between us. What did you tell Adrian I wanted? Mom recovered first. She stepped closer with the careful expression she used whenever she wanted the rest of us to believe she was the only calm person in the room. This is not the time, she said. Tessa is ill, everyone is emotional, and Jonah had no right to send you documents without preparing you. He did prepare me. He told me to ask you why my statement was changed. It was not changed. You were 16 and confused. We made the decisions you were incapable of making. Sloane's hand tightened around the envelope. Did you tell Adrian I never wanted contact? Mom glanced toward me. Your sister needed certainty before taking responsibility for a newborn. That is not an answer. Dad stepped between them. Sloane, today has already been overwhelming. Let us go somewhere private and discuss this after you have had time to think. Sloane turned on him. Did you know? His face answered before his mouth did. Mom reached for Sloane's arm. We protected your future. Everything you achieved today happened because we refused to let one mistake destroy your life. Sloane pulled away. Tessa is not a mistake. The door to Tessa's room remained closed behind us. I was grateful she could not hear, but every raised voice made me imagine her sitting inside, wondering whether the adults had finally decided to help. I held up my phone and opened the screenshot. Did you send this? I asked. Sloane read the message again. Her expression shifted from confusion to disgust. No. Mom folded her arms. You may not remember every message you sent during a stressful morning. I would remember calling Tessa a child I gave away. That is what happened. No, that is what you always called it. Sloane took my phone and enlarged the image. She stared at the wording, then looked at Mom. You copied this from the email you made me write before college. I had never heard about that email. Sloane explained that when she was 18, she had asked whether she could contact me directly and receive pictures of Tessa. Mom had told her any contact would destabilize the adoption and risk having Tessa removed from my home. She then dictated an email in which Sloane promised to leave the child I gave away in the past. I never sent it to Adrian, Sloane said. You said you needed it for the attorney. Mom's composure slipped. I was trying to prevent both of you from making emotional decisions. You used my words to create a message today. You cannot prove that. Sloane unlocked her phone and opened the conversation with Mom. There was no message matching the screenshot. There was not even a discussion about leaving the graduation. I did not know Tessa needed a transplant test, she said. You told me she had a follow-up appointment, and Adrian was panicking again. Mom turned to me. You see what happens when private matters are dragged into the open? She is confused and blaming everyone. She is asking direct questions, I said. You are the one refusing to answer. Sloane looked at me, and for the first time the truth stood between us without our mother translating it. I am Tessa's biological mother, she said. Hearing the words aloud hurt in a way I had not expected. I had always known the fact, but our family had treated it like a dangerous object that had to remain wrapped and hidden. Now it was simply true, spoken in a hospital hallway, while Tessa waited for adults to decide whether they would show up. Sloane's eyes filled with tears. I thought you wanted me gone. I thought you wanted nothing to do with her. Mom told me you said contact would confuse Tessa and that you would fight me if I tried. She told me you wanted complete separation. Neither of us needed to ask who had lied. Sloane took a step toward me. Adrian, I did not know she was this sick. You knew she existed. The word stopped her. I know. You became an adult 6 years ago. You had my number. You knew where I lived. I thought contacting you would make things worse. Did you ever check? She lowered her eyes. No. I had spent years imagining what I would say if Sloane ever tried to claim a place in Tessa's life. In those fantasies, I was always calm and certain. Standing in front of her now, I felt anger, pity, and fear at the same time. You were controlled when you were 16, I said. I understand that now, but what about afterward? Sloane wiped her face with the back of her hand. Afterward, Mom paid my tuition. She controlled my car, my apartment, and every account I used. Whenever I asked about Tessa, she said you hated me. Part of me believed her because believing her meant I did not have to find out what you really thought. Mom made a sound of disbelief. After everything we sacrificed for you. Sloane did not turn toward her. They controlled me when I was 16, she said. But after I became an adult, silence became my choice. The admission did not repair anything, but it mattered that she did not hide behind her age forever. She looked through the window in Tessa's door. Can I still be tested? Dr. Park stepped forward. Yes, but I need you to understand that testing is voluntary. Being a biological parent means you will share part of Tessa's HLA profile, but it does not guarantee you will be the safest donor. You will need additional screening. I understand. Mom moved between Sloane and the donor center hallway. You are not making a medical decision while distressed. I am 24. You are about to throw away everything we built for you. You mean the life you built around keeping me quiet? If you do this, do not expect us to keep paying for your apartment. The car belongs to us. Your insurance is through your father. Think carefully before you choose Adrian's drama over your family. Sloane stared at her for several seconds, then reached into her purse. She placed a set of car keys and a credit card on top of the leather folder. You kept saying graduation proved I had a future, she said. If that future only belongs to me while I obey you, it was never mine. She unwound the gold tassel from her hand and set it beside the discarded donor bands. Then she walked with Dr. Park toward the registration desk. Mom called after her, but Sloane did not stop. Dad picked up the keys. This has gone too far. I looked at the band he had torn from his wrist. Who deleted the hospital's voicemail? He stiffened. What voicemail? The transplant coordinator left one for Sloane. It disappeared from the shared phone account. Mom answered before he could. No one deleted anything. Sloane, still close enough to hear, turned back. Dad manages the family account. Dad rubbed one hand over his face. Your mother said the message would upset you before the ceremony. Sloane stared at him. So you heard it? I only heard part of it. Did it say, urgent donor evaluation? He did not answer. You knew, I said. You knew the hospital was trying to reach her, and you erased the message. I was trying to prevent chaos. No, you were preventing a choice. For years, Dad had hidden behind Mom's certainty. Now there was no space left for him to pretend he had merely stood nearby. Sloane completed the initial consent forms and provided the first samples. She did not ask to see Tessa. She understood that showing up as a donor did not give her immediate access to the child she had avoided for 8 years. Several hours later, Dr. Park returned with preliminary information. As Tessa's biological mother, Sloane was a half-match, as expected. The transplant team needed further testing before deciding whether she was medically suitable, but she was now the most promising related candidate available. Relief rose in me, and stopped before it became hope. Dr. Park's expression remained serious. Tessa's latest results show signs of an infection developing, she said. We can treat it, but it may narrow the time available for preparation. We need to complete Sloane's evaluation as quickly as possible. Sloane had finally chosen Tessa. The doctors still could not promise she had chosen in time. Sloane's preliminary result gave us a direction, not a guarantee. Dr. Park explained that biological parents were expected to share half of a child's HLA markers, but that did not automatically make Sloane the safest donor. The transplant team still needed blood tests, infectious disease screening, a physical examination, and an independent interview to confirm she was participating voluntarily. They would also consider her age, general health and factors in Tessa's immune profile before making a final recommendation. Sloane listened without interrupting, then signed permission for the next stage of testing. Mom and Dad left the hospital before the evaluation began. Mom took the leather folder, the car keys, and the credit card Sloane had returned, but she left the gold graduation tassel on the consultation room table. I picked it up and placed it in my bag because I did not want a cleaner throwing it away. A few hours earlier, that tassel had represented the ceremony my parents considered more important than Tessa's treatment. Now it marked the first thing Sloane had willingly walked away from to make her own choice. Tessa knew only that her aunt had come to be tested. She was awake when Sloane entered the room, wearing a hospital visitor badge, and her eyes moved immediately to the cotton pad taped over Sloane's arm. "Did the vampires get you too?" she asked. Sloane looked at me before answering, careful not to step into a role I had not offered her. "They said I was on the snack list," she replied, and Tessa nodded as if that confirmed an important medical theory. When the nurse brought another cheek swab kit, Tessa told Sloane it was the worst lollipop ever invented. Sloane asked whether it came in any better flavors, and Tessa said the hospital had chosen dust because doctors hated fun. Their exchange lasted less than a minute, but it was the first time I had seen them speak without Mom's silence standing between them. I felt relief and resentment at the same time. Sloane's presence helped Tessa, but one gentle conversation could not erase 8 years of absence. After Tessa fell asleep, I asked Sloane to meet me near the waiting room windows. She had changed out of her graduation dress and borrowed hospital scrubs from the donor unit because the medical team expected more tests. Without the cap, gown, and careful makeup, she looked younger than 24. She also looked more like the frightened teenager I remembered from the day Tessa was born. "I need you to understand something before this goes any further," I said. "Being tested does not give you the right to enter Tessa's life however you choose. I know. I am still her mother. You do not get to tell her the truth without me. Ask her to call you anything different or make promises about what happens after this. I would not do that. You have been here for 1 day. I need more than your word." Sloane accepted the accusation without defending herself. She said that when she arrived at the hospital, part of her had imagined donating would be a single action that proved she was not the person Mom had made her believe she was. After speaking with the donor counselor, she understood that the procedure would not decide what place she deserved in Tessa's life. "I can help medically if they approve me," she said. Everything else has to happen at her pace, and yours. I told her that showing up mattered, but it did not cancel the years when she could have searched for the truth and chose not to. She nodded and said she had spent most of her adult life convincing herself that leaving Tessa alone was an act of respect. That explanation allowed her to accept tuition payments, use Mom's car, and avoid asking questions that might have forced her to choose. I thought guilt was the same as responsibility, she said. It is not. Her phone rang while we were speaking. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and Sloane answered on speaker after asking whether I wanted to hear. Mom's voice was soft and wounded rather than angry. She said Adrian would use the donation to bind Sloane to a sick child forever, then discard her once the transplant was complete. She warned that I had always been jealous of Sloane and was using the affidavit to punish the family for giving my sister opportunities I never had. Sloane listened until Mom finished. "Did you give the hospital the wrong number for me?" she asked. Mom ignored the question and said the family could still fix everything if Sloane left before completing the evaluation. She promised to restore access to the apartment, car, and insurance, but only if Sloane signed a statement saying she had been emotionally pressured at the hospital. Sloane told her the donor team had already interviewed her alone and had made it clear she could withdraw without consequences. "The pressure is coming from you," she said before ending the call. I expected her to cry, but she only stared at the dark phone screen. She said Mom had always made obedience sound like protection and punishment sound like concern. For the first time, Sloane could hear the pattern while it was happening, instead of years later. I did not comfort her. She needed to experience the loss of that illusion without me taking responsibility for making it easier. Jonah contacted me that afternoon with another piece of evidence. While reviewing archived emails, he had found a message Beverly sent him shortly before the adoption was finalized. In it, Mom demanded that he remove Sloane's request for photographs and future contact from the final arrangement. She wrote that keeping those wishes in the file would give Sloane false hope and allow her to interfere with the stable family Adrian would provide. Jonah had responded that Sloane's wishes should remain documented, even if contact was deferred. Mom replied that another attorney had advised otherwise and threatened to move the entire process if he delayed placement. There was no attached opinion from another lawyer, and no record that Sloane had received independent representation. The email did not prove every legal allegation on its own, but it showed that Mom had not merely misunderstood a frightened teenager. She had deliberately tried to erase Sloane's stated desire to remain informed. I forwarded the email to Sloane. She read it beside me and covered her mouth with one hand. "She told me you asked for no contact," she said. I believed her, but belief did not mean immediate forgiveness. Every new document showed how carefully Mom had divided us, yet it also showed how rarely either of us had challenged the division once we became adults. The transplant team completed most of Sloane's evaluation the following day. Dr. Park told us that Sloane remained the strongest related candidate currently available. Her age and health worked in her favor, and the initial antibody review did not reveal an obvious barrier. However, the team still needed final clearance, and Tessa's infection had to respond to treatment before conditioning for the transplant could begin. "Does this mean she can save her?" Sloane asked. "It means she may be able to donate," Dr. Park replied. "The transplant itself will still carry serious risks, and Tessa's body must be ready to receive it." I appreciated the answer because it gave us hope without pretending hope was certainty. Sloane was not a miracle that had arrived at the final moment. She was one possible path, and we still had to walk every difficult step of it. That evening, Tessa's temperature began to fall. She asked whether Sloane had passed the vampire exam, and I told her the doctors were still checking. Tessa said adults took too long to decide simple things, then fell asleep with the blue drawing of Mars beneath her hand. My phone began vibrating on the windowsill shortly after midnight. At first, I assumed it was another hospital update. Instead, I saw messages from former colleagues, distant relatives, and people I had not spoken to in years. Each one contained a link to the same public post. Mom had uploaded a photograph of herself and Dad outside the graduation hall. Beneath it, she claimed I was using Tessa's illness to blackmail my family, force Sloan into a medical procedure, and reopen a confidential adoption out of jealousy. She called herself a grandmother being punished for refusing to surrender to emotional extortion. My mother had failed to control the truth inside the hospital, so she had decided to manufacture a new one outside it. By morning, my mother's post had spread far beyond the relatives who usually applauded everything she did. She described herself as a devoted grandmother who had rushed to the hospital, only to be threatened with the release of confidential adoption records, unless she and my father agreed to become donors. She never mentioned the wrong phone number, the fabricated message from Sloan, or the agreement she had tried to make me sign. Instead, she said I had used Tessa's illness to punish the family for celebrating my sister's success. The photograph beside the post made the lie more convincing. Mom and Dad stood outside the graduation hall with their arms around each other, looking exhausted and dignified. The caption ended with Mom's professional title and the name of the organization where she served on the leadership board. She wrote that families should never be coerced into medical procedures, especially by people willing to weaponize a child's suffering. Some readers questioned her, but many believed the version that matched the woman they knew. Former teachers praised her strength. Members of her organization wrote that she had spent her life protecting vulnerable young women and would never endanger a child. Others came directly to my page and accused me of forcing Sloan to donate, reopening a closed adoption for revenge, and using Tessa to gain sympathy. One message came from a woman I had worked with years earlier. She asked whether I had really threatened my parents with legal action while my sister was preparing to graduate. Another person wrote that a donor should never be pressured by guilt, as if I had been the one offering apartments and insurance in exchange for obedience. The most painful messages insisted that a loving mother would protect her sick child from public scandal instead of creating one. I wanted to answer every accusation. I wanted to upload the cropped screenshot, the incorrect phone number, and the agreement Mom had brought to the hospital. Anger made explanations seem urgent, but Tessa was asleep 3 feet away, connected to machines that did not care which version of our family received more approval online. Jonah called before I posted anything. He told me to save copies of Mom's statement, the comments and every message sent to me because the post contained claims that could later matter. He advised me not to release the affidavit or Tessa's medical information in anger. Once private details were public, no legal victory could return them to my daughter. I wrote one short response after discussing it with the hospital's social worker. I stated that all donor participation was voluntary, that Tessa's medical privacy would remain protected, and that I would not debate a child's treatment on social media. I did not mention the adoption or accuse anyone by name. Mom interpreted my restraint as weakness and added a comment saying she hoped I would choose truth over vengeance before more lives were damaged. Sloan saw the post after completing another donor appointment. She read it twice, then asked whether Mom had always written about me that way when I was not present. I told her Mom rarely needed to lie completely. She took one real fear, removed the surrounding facts, and arranged it until she appeared to be the only reasonable person left. I need to respond, Sloan said. You do not owe the public your entire history. I am not doing it for them. She is telling everyone you forced me. Sloan wrote her statement at the small table beside the hospital cafeteria. She did not identify herself as Tessa's biological mother or describe the adoption in detail. She said she had entered the donor evaluation voluntarily, had been interviewed privately, and understood she could withdraw at any time without punishment from the hospital or from me. She also stated that our parents had not told her Tessa needed urgent family testing before the graduation ceremony. They had provided the hospital with an incorrect phone number, deleted a voicemail, and falsely informed me that she had refused to participate. She ended by asking people not to use her graduation or Tessa's illness as material for a public campaign. Mom called her less than 5 minutes after the statement appeared. Sloan let it ring without answering. Then she received an email from the executive director of Mom's organization asking whether she was willing to speak privately with its ethics committee. Mom had attached her title to the post, turning a family dispute into a professional matter. The organization supported pregnant teenagers, young mothers and families navigating adoption. Allegations that one of its leaders had pressured her own 16-year-old daughter and later interfered with urgent medical communication could not be dismissed as ordinary family conflict. Jonah sent the committee only the evidence necessary to evaluate Mom's conduct. He included the email in which she demanded removal of Sloane's request for future contact, the incorrect number supplied to the hospital, and the message offering restored financial support if Sloane claimed she had been pressured. He did not send Tessa's full medical file or release the affidavit publicly. The truth did not need to become entertainment to remain evidence. By late afternoon, Mom's name had disappeared from the leadership page of the organization's website. Jonah received confirmation that she had been temporarily suspended while the board reviewed the matter. The post remained online, but the comments changed as people began asking why she had used her professional title to attack the mother of a hospitalized child. Dad called me shortly after the suspension notice arrived. He sounded tired and frightened, but his first concern was not Tessa. "Your mother is losing everything," he said. "You need to tell the board this was a misunderstanding." She published the accusation. She was emotional. She gave the hospital the wrong number and helped keep Sloane away. That was Beverly's decision. His attempt to separate himself from her was so immediate that I almost laughed. For years, Dad had defended every cruel choice as something necessary for family peace. Now that consequences had arrived, he wanted to become a silent witness instead of a participant. "I can tell Jonah that I was not involved," he continued. "I did not write the message or prepare the agreement." "Who deleted the voicemail?" He stopped speaking. I waited until he finally answered. "Your mother asked me to check the family account. She said the hospital had exaggerated the urgency and the message would ruin Sloane's ceremony. And you erased it. I thought we would handle the testing the next day. You heard the hospital say urgent donor evaluation. I did not understand what that meant. You understood enough to hide it from Sloane." Dad's voice dropped. "I was trying to keep your mother calm." That sentence finally ended the excuse I had accepted for most of my life. My father had not been powerless beside Mom. He had simply chosen the person whose anger was most inconvenient to him, then allowed everyone else to carry the cost. "You were never keeping the peace," I said. "You were choosing who had to suffer so you would not have to confront her." He asked whether I would tell the board he had acted under pressure. I told him the truth about his role would come from the call records, the hospital message, and his own testimony. I would not create another lie to rescue him from the first one. That evening, Dr. Park confirmed that Sloane remained medically eligible while the final donor review continued. Tessa's infection was responding, but she still needed close monitoring. I turned off notifications and sat beside her while she worked on another drawing, this time a hospital on Mars where every test came with ice cream. The argument outside her room began just before visiting hours ended. Mom's voice carried down the hallway before I saw her. She had come alone, still wearing the same blue suit from the graduation, though one pearl button was missing, and her hair had lost its careful shape. Security stopped her near the nurses' station because her name had been removed from Tessa's visitor list. Mom demanded to speak with me, saying I had destroyed her career and turned Sloane against the family. I stepped into the hallway and closed Tessa's door behind me. "Leave," I said. "You are not permitted near her." Mom's face tightened. "Call the board and withdraw the accusations. Tell them you misunderstood the adoption documents." "I did not contact them. Your public post brought them into this. You gave Jonah permission to send private material." I allowed him to respond with evidence. She moved closer and lowered her voice. "You think keeping Tessa in that room protects her from the truth? If you do not stop this investigation, I will tell her myself who Sloane really is. I will tell her before the transplant, before you have another chance to turn her against me." My mother had lost control of the adults, so she reached for the one person too sick and too young to defend herself. My mother's threat made the decision easier than I expected. I turned toward the security officer and said Beverly Keller was no longer allowed to approach Tessa, contact her through hospital staff, or leave messages at the nurse's station. Mom stared at me as though I had misunderstood who held authority in our family. When the officer asked her to leave, she warned that I could not keep a grandmother away forever. I told her being related to Tessa did not give her permission to frighten a sick child, especially after she had just threatened to reveal private information as punishment. Mom tried to argue that she had a legal right to see her granddaughter. The security officer calmly explained that I was Tessa's parent, and the hospital would follow the authorized visitor list unless a court ordered otherwise. Mom looked toward the closed door of Tessa's room, calculating whether she could raise her voice loudly enough to be heard. I stepped between her and the doorway. "You will not use the truth as a weapon against her," I said. "Not today, and not ever again." She left only after security warned that refusing could result in her removal from the property. I watched her walk toward the elevator, still convinced she was the injured party. Even after threatening an 8-year-old child, she believed my boundary was the cruelty. I asked the nurses to add a note to Tessa's chart, stating that no information should be released to Beverly or Raymond. The hospital changed the visitor password and instructed staff to transfer all family calls directly to me. I had spent years worrying that strong boundaries would create more conflict. Standing outside Tessa's room, I finally understood that conflict already existed. My silence had only allowed my mother to choose where it landed. The hospital social worker, Marisol Vega, met with me that evening. I told her Tessa knew she was adopted but did not know Sloane was her biological mother. I explained that Beverly had threatened to reveal it before the transplant in the most damaging way possible. Marisol did not tell me to hide the truth or disclose everything immediately. She asked what Tessa already understood, how she responded to difficult information, and whether Sloane accepted that Adrian was her mother in every practical and emotional sense. "Tessa notices when adults are avoiding something," I said. "She may not know the secret, but she knows there is one. Then complete silence may frighten her more than a careful explanation," Marisol replied. "The goal is not to give her every adult detail. The goal is to make sure the truth comes from the people protecting her, not from someone trying to cause harm." We agreed that Tessa did not need to hear about coercion, falsified messages, or legal documents before the transplant. She did need to understand why Sloane had become the most promising related donor and why the adults around her were behaving differently. Marisol also warned me not to promise that Tessa would feel grateful, curious, or affectionate toward Sloane. Children were allowed to react in ways that made adults uncomfortable. I found Sloane in the donor unit completing the final consent review. She listened while I explained Mom's threat and the plan Marisol had suggested. Her face tightened when she realized Beverly had been willing to ambush Tessa with the truth just to stop the investigation. "I will follow whatever you decide," Sloane said. "I will not tell her alone, and I will not ask her to call me anything." "This is not only my decision," I said. "Once Tessa knows, she will have choices too." Sloane nodded. "I understand." I made her say the part that mattered most. "Who is Tessa's mother?" "You are." "And what are you asking for?" "The chance to help her medically now. Anything after that has to be earned, and it has to be safe for her." For the first time since she arrived, I believed she understood the difference between biological connection and parental authority. The answer did not erase the past, but it allowed us to face Tessa together without turning the conversation into a struggle over ownership. Tessa was sitting upright when we entered her room, arranging plastic cups into what she called a research laboratory. She noticed Marisol behind us and immediately became suspicious. "This looks like a meeting," she said. "Meetings never have good snacks." Marisol promised to bring better snacks later, then sat near the window while I took Tessa's hand. I told her the doctors had learned that Sloane had a special biological connection to her, which was why their HLA markers shared a predictable pattern. Tessa stared at me, waiting for the part adults usually delayed. What kind of connection? Sloan gave birth to you, I said. I became your mother and raised you from the day you came home. Both things are true. Tessa looked at Sloan, then back at me. So Aunt Sloan is my birth mother? Yes. Does that mean you are not my real mom? The question hurt, but I kept my voice steady. I am your real mom. I have been your mother every day of your life, and that will not change. Sloan remained near the door instead of moving closer. Adrian is your mom, she said. I am not here to take her place. I came because I should have known you needed help, and I want to do what the doctors say I safely can. Tessa studied her for several seconds. Did you know about me before? Yes. Then why didn't you come sooner? Sloan swallowed. When I was younger, people made decisions for me. When I got older, I was afraid to ask the questions I should have asked. That was wrong, and none of it was your fault. Tessa looked down at the tape around her fore. I expected tears, but what came was quieter and sharper. Then why did everybody act like it was something bad? No one answered immediately, because the honest answer belonged to the adults, not to her. I told her there had never been anything shameful about her birth, or about being loved by more than one person. The shame came from the lies, and fear the adults had placed around the truth. Tessa asked whether she had to call Sloan something different. I said no. She asked whether Sloan would move into our house. Sloan answered no before I had to. Finally, Tessa asked whether the cells would know where to go once they entered her body. Dr. Park joined us later and explained the transplant in simple terms. The preparation treatment would weaken Tessa's existing marrow so the donated stem cells could begin building a new blood-forming system. She warned us that the days after transplant could be difficult, and complications were possible even with the best available donor. Sloan received final medical clearance the next morning. The team confirmed she was the strongest related candidate currently available, but no one called her a perfect match or promised success. She completed the donation procedure under the supervision of a separate medical team whose responsibility was her safety. I stayed with Tessa while she underwent the conditioning treatment, watching her grow more tired as the medications did what they were designed to do. The donated cells arrived in a small bag that looked far too ordinary to hold so much hope. Tessa examined it and asked whether those were Sloan's superhero cells. Dr. Park told her they were ordinary cells, being given an important job. I was grateful for the answer. We had already allowed too many people to turn biology into destiny. As the cells flowed through the line, Sloan stood at the far side of the room and let me hold Tessa's hand. She did not ask for photographs or try to make the moment about forgiveness. When Tessa became sleepy, Sloan quietly left so the room would remain calm. Jonah called that afternoon. The preserved messages, altered contact information, and old emails gave him enough to prepare a civil complaint concerning misrepresentation, interference with medical communication, and the handling of Sloan's original statement. The organization's board had also expanded its investigation after receiving Mom's public accusations. He reminded me that none of those proceedings would resolve quickly, and I told him speed no longer mattered as much as making sure the record could not be rewritten again. For several hours after the transplant, Tessa remained stable. I allowed myself to believe we had crossed the most dangerous part. Then, shortly after midnight, her temperature climbed rapidly. Her breathing changed. Alarms sounded and nurses entered before I could press the call button. Dr. Park ordered medication and additional tests while the team worked around the bed. Sloan arrived in the hallway but did not enter until I asked for her. She stood beside me as Tessa shook beneath the blankets, both of us helpless, while the doctors responded to an early complication they had warned us could happen. We had finally told the truth, and Sloan had given everything the doctors safely allowed her to give. None of it could promise that Tessa would survive the night. The nurses moved so quickly that I could no longer distinguish one instruction from another. Tessa's temperature continued rising while Dr. Park ordered cultures, fluids, and medication through the central line. Her breathing became shallow, and the monitor beside her bed sounded each time her oxygen level fell. I stood against the wall because there was nowhere else to go, holding the edge of her blanket while the medical team worked around me. Dr. Park had warned us that fever and inflammatory reactions could occur after transplant, but hearing about a risk was nothing like watching it happen to my child. Tessa opened her eyes once and whispered that she felt cold, even though heat radiated from her skin. I told her I was beside her and that the doctors knew what to do. She nodded weakly, trusting me to promise something I had no power to guarantee. Sloane waited outside until a nurse allowed her into the room. She had been discharged from the donor unit only hours earlier and still moved carefully from the soreness of the procedure. She did not ask questions while Dr. Park was working or try to stand beside Tessa's bed. Instead, she brought me water, wrote down the names of the medications, and repeated the doctor's updates when exhaustion made it difficult for me to remember them. At one point, Sloane asked whether I wanted her to leave. I looked through the glass at the woman who had spent 8 years outside my daughter's life, then at the notes she had taken because I could no longer hold information in my mind. "Stay in the hallway," I said. "I will call you if Tessa wakes." She accepted the boundary without turning it into another injury I had to comfort. The fever peaked shortly before 3 in the morning. Tessa's blood pressure dropped enough that the team moved her to closer monitoring, and I followed the bed through the corridor with my hand resting on the rail. Sloane walked behind us at a distance, carrying my bag and Tessa's blue drawing of Mars. She did not have to be told that the picture mattered more to me than anything else we had left in the room. While we waited outside the new unit, I thought about how often my parents had used blood as proof of loyalty. Mom believed being Tessa's grandmother gave her the right to make decisions, demand silence, and return whenever she chose. Sloane had always shared blood with Tessa too, yet that connection had meant nothing while she remained absent. Biology had created a relationship, but only choice had given it value. Dr. Park came out after sunrise. Tessa had responded to the medication, and her blood pressure was stabilizing. The fever had begun to fall, though the team would continue watching her closely for infection and other complications. Dr. Park did not say we were safe, only that Tessa had made it through the immediate crisis. Relief did not arrive as happiness. It came as the ability to breathe without pain for the first time in hours. I leaned against the wall, and Sloane sat beside me without touching me. Neither of us celebrated because Tessa still faced weeks of uncertainty, but for that morning, she was alive and moving in the right direction. My phone had accumulated more than 30 missed calls while we were in the unit. Jonah had left 2 messages marked urgent, but I waited until Dr. Park allowed me back beside Tessa before returning them. He told me the ethics committee had completed its preliminary review of Mom's conduct. The evidence showed she had used her position and the organization's public reputation to support false accusations while concealing information directly relevant to its work with vulnerable young mothers. The board had voted to remove her from leadership effective immediately. They also planned to issue a statement clarifying that her public comments did not represent the organization. Jonah warned me that the civil case would take longer, but Mom's own post and the agreement she brought to the hospital had established a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as a private misunderstanding. Mom called while Jonah was still explaining the process. I let it go to voicemail, then received a message from Dad, asking me to speak with him before he gave a formal statement. Jonah advised me not to coach or negotiate with either of them. If Dad wanted to separate himself from Mom, he would have to do it by telling the complete truth under oath. Dad arrived at the hospital later that afternoon. He was not permitted near Tessa, so I met him in a small waiting area with Jonah present by video call. Dad looked older than he had 2 days earlier. He said Mom had made most of the decisions, and that he had never intended to harm Tessa or interfere with treatment. Jonah asked who accessed the shared phone account and deleted the hospital voicemail. Dad admitted he had done it. When asked who witnessed the original family documents 8 years earlier, he admitted his signature appeared on them. He also acknowledged hearing Mom threaten to withdraw financial support from Sloane if she contacted me directly. "I was trying to keep Beverly from making things worse," he said. "You helped her make them possible," I replied. "Every time you stayed quiet, You left the rest of us alone with her decisions. Dad said he had felt trapped for years. I told him Sloan had been trapped at 16, Tessa had been trapped by an illness, and I had been trapped by incomplete information. He had been an adult, with the ability to say no. His fear of upsetting his wife did not erase the choices he made to protect himself. He asked whether he could see Tessa when she improved. I told him no. A late confession did not restore access to the child whose medical message he had deliberately erased. If he wanted to begin taking responsibility, he could provide complete testimony, release every communication he still possessed, and stop asking his daughters to reduce the consequences for him. Mom's voicemail arrived that evening. Her voice was quieter than it had been during any of our confrontations. She said she had lost her position, friends were refusing her calls, and reporters had contacted the organization. She asked me to tell Jonah that the situation had been misunderstood before it spread any further. She did not ask about Tessa until the final seconds. Even then, she said, I assume the transplant went forward. As if my daughter's survival were a minor detail in a crisis centered on Beverly Keller's reputation. I called her back, only because I wanted her to hear my answer directly. You were willing to let my daughter lose her chance to live so you could keep your story, I said. Now you can live with the truth. Mom began explaining that everything she had done was intended to save Sloane's future. I ended the call before she could turn coercion into sacrifice again. For the first time in my life, I did not need her to understand why she was wrong before I allowed the consequences to remain. Tessa woke properly the following morning. Her voice was weak, but she recognized me and asked whether the hospital vampires had finished their work. When Sloane appeared at the doorway, Tessa watched her for a moment, then asked if she had brought the gold string from graduation. I took the tassel from my bag and showed it to her. Tessa asked whether she could keep it in a box with Sloane's donor wristband and her own hospital bracelet when we went home. She said they belonged together because one showed where Sloane had been going, and the others showed where she had chosen to come instead. I promised we would make the box when she was strong enough. As Tessa fell asleep again, I realized that surviving the night had not solved everything waiting beyond the hospital. My parents had lost their power to dictate our story, but Sloane's place in Tessa's future had not yet been decided. Tessa had fought to keep her life, and now we had to decide who deserved to remain inside it. 4 months after the transplant, Tessa was finally allowed to spend more time outside her room, though our lives still revolved around medication schedules, laboratory appointments, and the fear hidden inside every unexpected fever. Her hair had begun growing back in soft, uneven patches, and she insisted it made her look like a baby bird preparing for winter. She attended school from home, complained about math assignments, and covered our refrigerator with drawings of the hospital on Mars. Dr. Park reminded us that recovery would be measured in months rather than one dramatic moment, but each ordinary complaint felt like evidence that Tessa was returning to herself. Sloane did not move into our house or begin appearing without warning. She rented a small apartment with money from her first job and returned the remaining property our parents had used to control her. Before every visit, she asked me whether the timing was appropriate, and she accepted no without treating it as punishment. Some weeks, Tessa wanted Sloane to sit with her through an entire movie. Other weeks, she preferred a 10-minute visit and then asked to be alone. Sloane followed her lead. She also began therapy and attended meetings for adults who had experienced coercion around pregnancy and adoption. I did not ask her to report what she discussed there. Her healing was not something she needed to perform for my approval, but her relationship with Tessa had to be built through consistent behavior I could see. She arrived when she promised, never spoke negatively about me, and did not use the donation as proof that Tessa owed her affection. The civil case moved slowly, just as Jonah had warned. The preserved emails, altered contact information, and agreement Mom brought to the hospital became part of the official record. Beverly's former organization permanently removed her from its leadership and issued a public statement explaining that her conduct did not reflect its values. She lost the reputation she had protected more fiercely than her granddaughter's chance of finding a donor. But she continued telling anyone who would listen that our family had been destroyed by an ungrateful daughter. Raymond moved into a rented apartment after separating from her. He provided the call records and admitted under oath that he had deleted the hospital voicemail and witnessed the pressure placed on Sloan 8 years earlier. He wrote me several letters saying he finally understood how often his silence had protected the person causing harm. I believed he understood more than before, but understanding did not erase what he had done. He asked to attend one of Tessa's follow-up appointments. I refused. Taking responsibility in a legal statement was necessary, but it did not immediately make him safe. I told him that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not automatically restore access to my daughter. For the first time, he did not accuse me of being cruel. He said he understood and stopped asking, though I knew part of him still hoped time alone would repair what his choices had broken. Beverly never accepted the boundary. She sent flowers to the hospital, gifts to our home, and letters addressed directly to Tessa. I returned every package unopened. When she created a new email account after I blocked the first one, Jonah sent a formal notice requiring all communication to go through him. Mom had spent years deciding which messages reached us. Now, she could not reach my child without passing through a boundary she had no power to rewrite. Once Tessa's health became more stable, Marisol helped us prepare for a fuller conversation about her birth. Tessa already knew Sloan had given birth to her, but she did not know why the adults had spent 8 years pretending the connection did not exist. We explained only what she was old enough to carry. Sloan had been 16, frightened and dependent on people who made decisions for her. Adrian became her mother because she could give her a safe home, but the adults had surrounded that arrangement with secrecy and lies. Tessa listened without interrupting. She asked whether Sloan had wanted her. Sloan answered carefully, "I loved you, but I was scared and did not know how to fight for a choice." Later, when I was old enough to ask questions, I kept avoiding them. That part was my responsibility. "Did Mom take me away from you?" Tessa asked. "No," Sloan said. "Adrian gave you a home and cared for you every day. She did not steal anything from me. Other people kept us from telling each other the truth." Tessa turned to me. "Were you scared too?" "Yes. I was afraid that asking too many questions would make someone take you away. I thought keeping quiet would protect you." "Did it?" The question was simple enough that I could not hide behind good intentions. Not completely. It protected you from some things, but it also helped the lies last longer. I should have asked more questions. Tessa was quiet for a while, then looked at Sloan. "You gave me the cells, but Mom gave me my whole life." Sloan's eyes filled, but she did not reach for Tessa or ask her to soften the words. "I know," she said. "I am not here to take her place. I am here because I want to stop running from mine." Tessa asked what Sloan's place was. I told her none of us had to decide everything that day. Sloan could remain her aunt and biological mother, but the relationship would grow only as quickly as Tessa felt safe. Tessa accepted that answer and asked whether Sloan would still bring the puzzle book she had promised for their next visit. The conversation ended not with a dramatic embrace, but with a disagreement over whether a 500-piece puzzle was reasonable for someone who hated sorting edge pieces. The box Tessa had planned in the hospital eventually sat on a shelf beside her bed. Inside were her transplant wristband, Sloan's donor band, and the gold graduation tassel. She wrote on the lid in uneven black letters, "The day everyone stopped lying." I did not correct her. The lies had not all ended in one day, but that was the day they stopped controlling our choices. Our parents came to the house 6 months after the transplant. I knew they were outside before the doorbell rang because Sloan had seen their car while helping Tessa prepare dinner. Beverly stood on the porch holding a wrapped gift, and Raymond remained one step behind her. Through the window, I could see Mom arranging her face into the expression she once used to make every confrontation look like an act of concern. Tessa noticed them too. She did not appear frightened, only thoughtful. "Do I have to talk to them?" she asked. "No." "Do you want to?" "No." She nodded. and returned to the table, where she was teaching Sloane how to fold napkins into shapes that looked nothing like the instructions. I walked to the window and met my mother's eyes through the glass. She lifted the gift and mouthed that they only wanted to talk. I closed the curtain. There was no shouting, no final argument, and no apology convincing enough to reopen the door. Beverly and Raymond had once believed that being our parents gave them permanent ownership of the family. They had learned too late that access was not inherited. It was maintained through honesty, responsibility, and care. When I returned to the table, Tessa had folded a napkin into something she claimed was a swan. Sloane said it looked like an injured chicken, and Tessa laughed so hard that I had to remind her to breathe slowly. The sound filled the small dining room and pushed everything outside the curtain farther away. Our family had become smaller, but it did not feel empty. Sloane was still earning her place. Tessa was still healing, and I was still learning that protecting peace did not mean allowing harmful people to remain. Nothing about our future was perfect, but it belonged to us now. Blood had made us relatives. Truth, responsibility, and the courage to stay had finally made us a family.